Welcome to Rooted and Ready, where Annie's Project brings you real conversations about risk, resilience, and the decisions shaping agriculture. I'm your host, Karisha Devlin. I'm a farmer and training and curriculum officer with Annie's Project. One challenge we hear about across nearly every sector of agriculture is labor. Finding enough reliable workers at the right time can be difficult, and many producers are exploring options they may not have considered a few years ago. One of those options is the H-2A Agricultural Guest Worker Program. While many people have heard of it, fewer understand what it actually involves, what it costs, and whether it's a realistic fit for their operation. Today we're joined by Nate Bruce, Farm Business Management Specialist with the University of Delaware. Nate has worked with producers across the Mid-Atlantic region to help them understand the H-2A process and evaluate its financial implications. Nate, welcome to Rooted and Ready.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
We're excited that you're here today, and as I was sharing before we kick-started the recording, that I think information that you're going to share with us is going to be of real value and benefit to our listeners. But before we start talking about H-2A specifically, what are you hearing from producers regarding labor challenges today?
Well, a lot of producers they say it's very hard to find reliable labor on the farm, and I think I just think about rural America and where we're at in the farming community. I mean, oftentimes farms are located where there's not a whole lot of people, so
Mm,
the applicant pool and potential workers are just not there. And I although I work at University of Delaware, I live across the state line in Maryland, and my
okay.
my my little town in Maryland, we only have 56 people according to the last census.
Wow.
And much of that population is aging. And I think, you look across rural America, that you see that in other communities. Another thing too is the farms itself. A lot of children from farmers are getting employment, off farm.
Mm-hmm.
So, the typical labor force of I'm going to have more kids, or, my son's going to take over, or my daughter, whoever it is, a lot of the times producers don't have that next generation coming forward. So I think, just where rural America is at, where farms are located, there's just not enough labor there to fulfill that demand.
Do you think that there is some issues as well? And when I say this, this has been my situation with me and my husband is also farming is hard work and long hours at times of the year. Do you think that is in any way kind of prohibitive to people wanting to, join as a farm laborer?
Oh, absolutely. And I think too, since COVID, the wages, real wages, what people need to survive, is what a farmer could pay a worker. It doesn't really match up very well.
Mm,
And I can't really think of anybody that wakes up and goes to school and says, "Hey, I want to pick tomatoes for the rest of my life," or something, or peppers, or whatever it is. I mean, it is hard work.
that it is. For listeners who may only know the term or have heard about it, what exactly is the H-2A program? How long has it been around?
So H-2A program is a work visa program. So an agricultural producer or cooperative or group of producers could go together and apply for work visas for foreign workers that come work for a set contract time period on their farm and do agricultural type work. It's different than the H-1B visa program. We had done outreach programs throughout the Mid-Atlantic, and one of the questions we asked was when was the program started? And we tricked a lot of people because most people think, it was in 1986 with the Immigration Reform and Control Act. And that act is well known because it split the H2A program from the H2B program. It split the visas separately, but established the real adverse effect wage, or I'm sorry, the adverse effect wage rates that we know with the program today. But actually, the program started in 1952 with the Immigration Nationality Act. So it's been around for a very long time. So yeah, almost, we're coming up on 60, 70 years of this program at this point.
I think that fact will surprise a lot of people. I know it surprised me when I heard you speak about it a couple of months ago. Why has the interest in the H-2A program really increased so dramatically in recent years? Because I know it's something that I've have been hearing more and more within the state that I'm in, and as well as nationally.
Yeah, so I think it's definitely producers are looking at the H-2A program as a way to fulfill, their labor needs. I mean, if you look at Farm Bureau, the National Farm Bureau has some really good economists out there that can show the trend, the total H-2A visas in the country that are given every year, and the chart it just goes up. It just skyrockets up. I think H-2A has always been common with produce growers in the country.
Hmm.
They have always been the major or a majority of the visas given are to producers in those types of operations. We were actually starting to see commodity crop growers apply for H-2A visas as well. A lot of the workers are coming in for places like South Africa where these visa holders, they're familiar with the type of equipment and such. And when they're growing their crops more in winter here. So it's a chance for them to come to the US, earn an American dollar and go back home in their off season. So you're starting to see that, come about too recently, which is interesting.
That is interesting. For those who are really intrigued by this and would like to know how in the world do you even participate, can you kind of walk us through that? How does somebody actually participate in the H-2A program?
So the very first step, my first, if I was to make a recommendation, first step, if you're interested in the H-2A program, contact your state Department of Labor. They are going to be the main organization that, helps you out from day one. There's a lot of business to business consulting firms that you can hire. But the State Department of Labor, they're going to be your regulatory agency, but they're also there to help you out to make sure that you're complying with federal and state laws when you employ workers, in your state. And the first step, to the H-2A program, you need to verify that you can't hire a domestic worker for the jobs you're looking for. So you're gonna have to file a job order with your state Department of Labor, and after that, if you can't find any domestic workers, then you can explore the H-2A process. But that's definitely the first place to start.
What are some of the requirements of the program? Because when I looked into it, I was kind of surprised. There is quite a list of things that you kind of need to check off.
Yeah, that's the biggest complaint of the program. There's a lot of things that you have to cover as an employer of H-2A workers. You have to make sure that you house them on the farm. That it could be off-farm housing. You could find like short-term apartment housing or hotel housing that satisfies the housing requirements. Local and state laws will dictate what is required for housing, but that's a pretty big expense, to house a work crew for the growing season. You have to cover their travel to and from their home countries. So whether that's from South America, maybe like Mexico or Guatemala or wherever it is, you have to cover that expense. So if you are interested in employing H-2A workers from, South Africa, think about flights and the cost of that. That could be pretty substantial. When the workers are in transit to and from their home countries, you also need to cover their meals too. You're on the hook for that. Now, when they do finally arrive to the farm and they're doing some work for the operation, they also need to be provided travel domestically. So, you need to make sure if you're sending them up to a farm up the road or another county over that, they have some kind of way of getting there. So you need to make sure you're thinking about that cost. And then also too, you need to give them time to go to the local grocery store and get food as well, at least once a week for subsistence. So, if they need to go to the local Walmart or the Kroger or whatever it is, you need to make sure that that time's available to them.
That segues into my next question because, one of the biggest questions that producers have is what is this going to cost me? And you've already listed some of them, just the housing, transportation. You mentioned the flights and then meals while they're traveling. What are some of the other things besides an hourly wage that you would need to be thinking about?
So definitely the housing costs, the transportation costs, but then also your visa costs as well.
Okay.
So there's a lot of different visas that you need to apply for that different agencies, you'll pay different agencies for them, like Department of Labor, Homeland Security. There's a whole bunch of federal organizations that tons of different types of visas. It's five or six. I can't remember off the top of my head, but there's quite a few. So those are costs that you also need to cover as well. If you're thinking about like a 6 month contract period, maybe 50 to 60 hours a week, you're probably looking at about 40 to 65,000 for that growing season for one worker. And as far as the program's changed a little bit. So this year versus years past, we now have two types of H-2A workers. We have a skill level one worker and a skill level two worker. And both of them have different adverse effect wage rates set by the Department of Labor, for the state that you're applying the job order in. So, here in Delaware, we have, I think it's 12. I'll pull it up actually real quick and take a look. But we actually have, 1276 for a skill level one worker and 1778 for a skill level two worker. And our neighboring state of Maryland, they actually have a lower adverse effect wage rate for their skill level two worker and a higher one for skill level one. So the adverse effect wage rates are different across the country. So even though I say it's 40 to 65,000 a year, it could be very different depending on what state you're located in.
Okay. The program is often described as paperwork heavy and it's highly regulated. Why is it important for producers to understand these requirements before just jumping in?
Yeah, it needs to be regulated and it has to be paperwork heavy because you're bringing a foreign national into the country.
Hmm.
And right now with the way things are, it's really important that that person is tracked, that we know where they are, and such. That's why there's a lot of paperwork. That's the biggest complaint to the program outside of the cost.
Okay. What are some of the most common mistakes or challenges that you see first-time participants encountering?
The biggest hiccup for first time users of the program is not having the paperwork in time.
Okay.
Whenever you're applying, paperwork, especially with a visa program like this, it's going to take some time for the federal government to process that request. And so if you need workers for May or June, you really need to have the paperwork in at the end of January, February. You need to be well ahead. I think a lot of producers, especially first time people that go through it, they don't realize that time constraint, and they're often find themselves, waiting on their workers to arrive. And
Mm,
when there's crops that need to go in the ground, you can't wait.
right.
Uh,
So 6 months, kind of as
yes,
an average
yeah, at
at
least.
time. So if someone is trying to decide whether H-2A is right for their operation and they're considering H-2A labor for the first time, what are some of those first steps you'd recommend?
First thing, if you've never gone through the program, you've never employed H-2A workers, I would highly recommend working with a business-to-business consulting firm that
Okay.
kind of guides you through the process. The visa process, you could do it yourself, but if you've never done it before, it can be very confusing. And also, the program's changed as well this year. So now we have that skill level one, skill level two worker. And a lot of these, business to business consulting firms, they'll charge based on maybe the number of workers or just kind of a one-time fee. And honestly, it's definitely worth it the first time to work with them. And then if once you become familiar with the program, if you feel comfortable to take the step on your own and do it your own, you can. But I definitely would recommend going that route if it's your first time.
What questions should we ask ourselves before deciding whether this program would make sense financially and operationally?
Yeah, definitely, I guess, what kind of labor needs do I have on the operation? And for how many hours a week do I need, help on the farm? Does it make sense? And then you think about your crop budgeting too. I know in Annie's project, we usually always cover, enterprise budgeting in our local Annie's project. But think about that hourly wage rate. Am I really generating enough revenue to sustain employing a worker on my farm for this? And not just thinking about the real wage, but the adverse effects wage rate, but the real wage of employing this worker. So I think that's really the big thing, the first step. What are my labor needs, and am I generating enough revenue to actually afford one of these workers? Can I make do with like a temporary seasonal worker that's local?
Mhm.
That's really the first step.
The whole H-2A program is really fascinating for me, and personally, my husband and I have thought about it. We haven't taken the plunge yet, and we've actually been fortunate in the last couple of years that we have found reliable labor, which was a huge relief. One of the things when we were asking around uh, other people that were doing it, we ran into a producer who has been doing it for several years to the point that he has the same people come back each year, and they've really developed a relationship. Do you see that happening other places?
Oh yeah, most definitely. Yeah.
So you could request like the same workers back.
Yes, yeah. It's interesting, So I started my career as a county agent in North Carolina. And down there, we had a lot of tobacco production still in the county where I was located. So a lot of them had H-2A workers. And I remember one of the farmers I worked with, I became really close with, he said that his crew leader was retiring, and it was an H-2A worker who had gone to work for him for almost 30 years.
Oh,
And,
wow.
and, and so, he had been there for a while through the program. And it's interesting because although we in the U.S. we think about ag labor, we all have a respect for it.
Hmm.
It's hard work and such. None of us really want to be doing that manual physical labor. But to a lot of these foreign nationals coming to the U.S. to do this work, the U.S. dollar, the exchange rate when they go home is sufficient that it's a full-time career. And
Hmm.
when they do retire, like that gentleman, I mean, he's able to retire in his home country doing pretty well.
So I have one last question for you. Where can listeners learn more about the program and find resources that you've been involved in helping develop?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Like I said earlier, definitely start with the State Department of Labor. They're going to be the organization that you're going to have to put the job order in. That the very first step, they're going to be responsible for doing the housing inspection on your farm. So they're going to come out and take a look at the housing. And the State Departments of Labor, we had done these outreach programs in the Mid-Atlantic. We've made sure to invite them to speak at all three programs in New Jersey, Maryland, and Delaware. So that the participants, they recognize who the folks were, because that's really the first place to start. I definitely would recommend starting there. And then we had developed some different materials. Our team developed a legal guide to the H-2A program, kind of steps if you're interested in participating in that. And you can find that on the University of Delaware Farm Business Management webpage. I'll make sure to give Karisha a link to that. And then also too, we actually developed a real wage calculator that takes into account all the expenses associated with the program. So you could download that. It's on Excel, and you can actually go through each tab and try to figure out what that real hourly wage is when you're doing your crop budgeting to see if it works financially for you. But you need a little bit of knowledge to understand how to use the tool. It's not super complicated. But the big data point you need is your state's adverse effect wage rate. Once you find that, you can kind of play around with it and make it work.
Well, thank you so much, Nate. And I'll be sure to include those links that you provide in our show notes so our listeners can access them.
Yeah. But thank you.
Labor is a critical part of managing risk and maintaining a successful agriculture operation. While H-2A isn't the right fit for every farm or ranch, understanding how the program works can help producers make informed decisions about their workforce needs. A big thank you to Nate for joining us today and sharing practical insights into the H-2A program. And thank you for listening to Rooted and Ready from Annie's Project. If you found this conversation helpful, subscribe, share the episode with others in agriculture, and join us next time for another conversation designed to help you learn, lead, and grow. Until next time, stay rooted in what matters and ready for what's next.